Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, or good day, good afternoon, good evening. I'm sure it's evening where many of you are. It's just past sunrise here in Australia, where I am. Excuse me. Just get some water. Didn't expect that. So, before we start, can we just do a sound check and a visual check? If people could indicate if they're hearing me okay, if this transmission is working okay. Terrific. Thank you. That's all good. We've started a new time here. For us, it's Sunday morning. So I'm hoping the internet will be good. Well, for those of you who are just tuning in for the first time, perhaps, I'm Ayya Jitindriya, and 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐢𝐵 is the other nun living here at 𝐓𝐫𝐵𝐻𝐻, and obviously the owner of the YouTube channel Wisdom of the Masters. And this is the first in a series of 6 videos that I'm going to do once every 6 weeks, particularly focusing on the teachings of early Buddhism. But as I said in the blurb, in the kind of brief intro on the videos, I don't want to make this a kind of an academic class type teaching. I really want to keep it quite alive and spontaneous, and particularly because my practice tradition is early Buddhism, particularly as practiced, at least the origins of my tradition is Thai forest Buddhism, which is a tradition that focuses primarily on meditation, although there's obviously study of the sutras or the original teachings we have of the Buddha. So I want to draw on this very profound tradition and profound teachings and try to convey to some degree how to practice with these teachings in our everyday lives as well as in our meditation practice. Because the teachings of the Buddha that come to us, this earliest strata of the teachings we have from the Buddha, they do focus on several areas, one of which is meditation. And meditation is the means and the vehicle oftentimes for bringing clarity and calm to the mind in order to gain insight or understand the true nature of this very mind and of existence itself. So insight arises spontaneously through clarity and wisdom. Insight is really understanding the way things work. But this process of meditation and insight is also in a context of lifestyle. So I'll go more into that because meditation can't succeed in some way without certain supportive conditions. So I'm glad that there's quite a lot of you joining in for this first one. Many people, of course, won't be able to join live, but these videos will be archived on both this channel and on our 𝐓𝐫𝐵𝐻𝐻 website for later viewing. So similarly to the format of our guided meditations and Q&A that we've been doing fortnightly for the most part, we'll start here with a guided meditation, maybe 20, 25 minutes. Then I'll give a talk on a particular topic. Today we'll look at just a brief intro to early Buddhism, the context of where these teachings are coming from, and particularly look at the Four Noble Truths. And during that time, I'll just be talking, and I just want you to listen and contemplate as I'm speaking. And when I finish, 45 minutes or so, then we'll open up for Q&A. And so we'll have a good portion of time for answering your questions. Okay, so let's make a start for this first guided meditation. So wherever you find yourself now, in whatever country, in whatever time zone, in whatever karmic context in your life, in whatever room you happen to be in, just bring your attention to bear in that very spot you find yourself. Usually we recognize the presence of the body, bring to mind the sensations of the body. The body has a quality of weight, of relative heaviness, with the force of gravity exerting on this body, pinning it to the earth. And whilst this body is such a primary part of our existence, it's amazing how often we ignore it, or it's not within our field of awareness, because we're so taken up with our thinking processes and perhaps under pressure to perform the duties we need to perform each day. So now is the time and letting the body come fully into awareness. You can keep your eyes open gently if you like, or let them rest closed. As you bring your awareness to the body, just feel the various sensations. Make yourself as comfortable as possible for being relatively still in the next 20 minutes or so, whether cross-legged on the floor or in a chair. Ensure that your position is upright without being stressed or tense, and supported enough that you're not slouching, which will, both situations will create tension. So we want a good, easeful balance in the body, restful balance. And as you pay attention to the body, or open your awareness to the sensations of body, the feeling of embodiment, you quite naturally become aware of the rhythm of the breath, which is an implicit part of the body. The body breathes. So letting this experience and these feelings, sensations of respiration, of the in and out breath, receiving them in awareness, being aware of how the body breathes, aware of the in-breath, the movement of the body with the in-breath, and aware of the out-breath, and the movement of the body with the out-breath. And let it be just the natural breath. The breath will change from being short and shallow to long and deep at different times. But particularly as you relax, you'll find that the body, every now and again, will take a nice, deep, long breath and a long, complete exhalation. And you'll notice with that how the body relaxes, the muscles relax, the heartbeat slows. It feels more easeful as we're allowing ourselves just to stop and to be, and let our awareness rest on this simple process of breathing, embodiment, just being in one spot. And even though the mind might be thinking or a little bit distracted, as we give our attention to the body, which is still, it helps the mind to become more still, our attention to become more present, our awareness to open, enter into a wider field of awareness, centered through the bodily experience, anchored through embodiment. Or in other words, using the body or experience of the body as a foundation for presence and mindfulness. So enjoy that relaxation, that feeling of stopping or slowing and resting. Like this is the time for letting go of the frantic running around, both physically and mentally. And just resting into this moment, enjoying breathing in and breathing out, fully aware, fully awake, fully present. And the simple instruction of the Buddha as we're entering into this meditation is simply to be aware of the in-breath and the out-breath, such that when you're breathing in, you simply know, I'm breathing in, or in-breath. And breathing out, you simply know, breathing out. And knowing this directly, when the breath is short and shallow, soft and light, we know that for what it is. And when it goes long and deep, we know it's a long and deep in-breath or out-breath. So all we need to know in this part of the meditation. Everything else we can let just drift aside or recede into the background. Any other thoughts or sensations that appear, sounds, they come, they go. But we allow our attention to be centered in and around this process of breathing as we feel it. Each breath, each moment of every breath is new, alive. Notice how when we allow our attention to rest on a simple experience such as the breath, it becomes a source of ease or calm, tranquility. Letting the mind actually defrag. It's usually so fragmented with different ideas and energies moving in different directions. Now letting it have a single focus or a less broad and fragmented focus. It's naturally calming, naturally peaceful, naturally enjoyable, in as much as tranquility and peace is pleasing, pleasant. So keep reminding yourself if your attention is running away with different threads of thoughts. Simply remember the breath. Where is the breath? How does the breath feel? Because the body is breathing. We just lose awareness of it. So simply remembering the breath to return your attention to this simplicity and presence, which is rejuvenative. the thoughts that come and go. They're an endless stream of habitual thinking processes. If you let it, it'll take your attention without end. So our effort here is simply to remember the breath. It's never far away, it's always just there. And as we do that, thoughts simply dissolve. Because they relied on your attention. Allow your meditation to deepen by appreciating the rest and calm that comes with this attention on the breath, on the body, on the feeling of tranquility itself, or ease itself. Allow your mind to mingle with that. And the habit streams will subtly hijack your attention. You'll find yourself traveling on streams of thought, forgetting the breath and the presence of the body. As soon as we become aware of that, we remember the breath and this present moment. The intention of this meditation, of stopping, of letting go, releasing the habit of chasing thoughts. And we arrive again in this present moment, awareness of now, body, breath, and the elements of being. And wherever you find yourself now, just recognize what's happening with thought. Just notice if mind is captured by thinking of the future or the past. Notice how the body is. And notice any particular mind state or mood or emotion that may be present, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Just notice it and breathe with it. And gently coming out of meditation, take a few moments to come back into an eyes open appreciation of the space where you are. And just notice the effects or the results of this 20 minutes of meditation. Physiologically, emotionally, mentally, just notice how that is for you. And coming back into this space of the internet connection, the space we're all sharing here in internet time, cyberspace time. So thank you for sharing that meditation. So perhaps just stretch a little bit, take a few moments just to find, stretch a bit. I'll talk for, as I said, about 45 minutes approximately. We'll see how it goes. And while I'm talking, perhaps a little different to our other sessions, is that I'm going to ask you not to put any comments or questions into the chat box, but to really just open your mind and listen to this Dharma. And if questions arise, maybe just take a note of them and pop them into the chat box once I've finished the talk, and then I'll be able to address people's questions. Sometimes there's questions arise in your own mind when you're listening to the Dhamma. They'll be answered as you continue to listen, as you continue to be present. So rather than distracting yourself with typing into the chat box, just continue to listen in a meditative space and see where we're at by the time I finish the talk with regards to Q&A. Okay, so so a new beginning of sorts with this 6-part series, discussing aspects of early Buddhism, but particularly sorry, I was just distracted because a question came in. That's why I don't want any. One of the reasons I don't want any questions. I'll come back to that question later. So I really want to focus on this conveying these most important practice paradigms of the Buddha's teachings. But first, I want to give you a little bit of context. I'm sure there are many people who will listen to this who may be quite new to Buddhism, or some who may be very seasoned practitioners. Nevertheless, I hope that all of you will get something out of these talks. So a bit of context for what we're calling early Buddhism. We're really looking at the period after let's just begin. The Buddha lived around the 5th century BCE. Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha after his awakening, or upon his awakening. And Buddha was a term that was used for awakened beings, those who'd fully awaked. Buddha means awake or awakened. And just that word awakened, it means something, doesn't it? We awaken out of sleep. We awaken out of dreaming. So, it's a very direct pointing to this experience of waking out of what seems to be real, such as a dream when we're in it. But when we wake up, we recognize it was a play of the mind in some sense. The mind was under certain, what we call illusory conditions, or in an illusory state, because when we awaken, we realize, no matter how much unpleasant stuff that was going on there, or pleasant stuff within the dreams, it's really not made of anything but movements of the mind. And when we awaken, we feel, that was just a dream, and it's completely receded into the past as a past experience. And we also see it as not real in regards to, say, our wakeful life, our waking reality, if you like. So applying this to what we call enlightenment or awakening or illumination in some other translations, it's a waking up, a seeing clearly into the true nature of this very mind, this very experience for us as human beings. But also a waking up, a gaining of clarity as to the nature of this mind, the nature of the so-called illusion or dream, and the nature of enlightenment or awakening. So when the Buddha was first awakened, so I'm just going to ask again if people could refrain from putting questions into the chat box for now. Really just listen and hold your questions. They'll be answered, whether within the talk or at the end. But it's helpful just for everyone to refrain from using that chat box for a little bit longer. So, as I was saying, what the Buddha awakened to, or in his awakening, legend has it, or it comes down to us within the scriptures, that he really did consider not teaching, not trying to convey what this experience was or what his understanding was, because he said this is so subtle, this profound understanding. And what he awakened to is what is talked about as the deathless, or freedom from suffering, freedom from birth, aging, death, freedom from all kinds of suffering. There was still the body, there was still his body that had to go through aging and death, but what he'd realized was that there was going to be no more rebirth for him. And as a result, no more actual suffering, mental, emotional suffering in this life, because of his clarity of understanding. He understood what the body was. He understood what the mind was. He understood what illusion was. He understood what awakening was, what suffering was, how it's caused, how it comes to cessation, how the mind is freed from cycles of suffering in its various forms. But he actually considered it was such a profound awakening, and perhaps something that he thoroughly did not expect, quite naturally, that he wondered how to convey this. It is so subtle. And it's often said in the teachings that it's actually, this understanding is beyond description, because our words and our languages, our ways of communicating are so embedded in subject-object dualities, in terms of the way we talk about me and you, this and that, self and other, here and there. If you look into all the ways we construct concepts, it's rooted in a dualistic apprehension of reality. And in some ways, without recognizing that and without questioning the function of language and the way concepts construct certain experiences, we don't come to understand an underlying reality that transcends this. So just, tag that for a moment. We'll come back to that. Nevertheless, and it's said that many beings who awaken find it difficult to put their experience into words. And thus we do get different expressions of this experience of awakening and this new perspective on reality. And often these, if we look across the world's spiritual traditions, we have different ways of expressing this profound awakened realizations. And inevitably, almost inevitably, beings who do awaken to that profundity will use the expressions of their own tradition to attempt to describe that or lead others to, in a way that they may also experience something similar, or at least to challenge what their current experience is. But you'll also find within each tradition you'll get profound teachings from the masters that almost transcends their own tradition, that they eventually find words that are more universal, that are not just linked to a narrative that has guided them perhaps within their own tradition, whether it's based on different cosmologies or a monotheistic tradition or polytheistic. You'll find masters of those traditions coming out of that and really being able to recognize the universality and even come to speak and describe a more universal understanding of things. So when the Buddha was finally encouraged to try to convey his experience, he did concede there were those with little dust in their eyes that may understand, but yet it was still a bit of a ways for him to begin to put this into words. And so within the social, religious context of his day, it had to be contextual, right? The teaching has to speak to people in the current social, religious, spiritual milieu. At that time in India, there was Brahmanism was, we had the history of the Vedic tradition, which is a whole lot of different kind of spiritual voices in an oral tradition. using particular language. And this term nirvana, or this idea of seeking the deathless reality, the unconditioned reality, in order to transcend the limitations of the death-bound experience of individuals. These were all concepts already extant in his society and amongst the spiritual seekers, that the community that he would begin to speak to. So quite naturally, these terms were going to be used. But he also turned some of those terms around and turned them on their heads to try to point to something more distinct that he'd realized. So within one of the first teachings he gave, he actually returned to a group of friends that he was, until that time, quite recently practicing asceticism with, a group of 5 monks. So the Buddha actually stopped his ascetic practices prior to his awakening, because he was at the point of severe malnutrition, potentially death. They used to eat very little, try to gain insight through, in a way, denying the body or challenging the body with extreme difficulty, with this idea that if one could concentrate the mind to let go of the body enough, that one would achieve a transcendent understanding. Whilst these practices, which still go on in India, may help some people attain a deep concentration which transcends the body, the Buddha found that it didn't lead to awakening. It didn't lead to the end of suffering. He defined awakening as the end of suffering, the end of dukkha. Even as he still had a body that was going to age, potentially get ill and die, it was still, the realization was the end of dukkha, because that body was no longer, this body was no longer something that he attached to or identified with, but understood as a karmic formation that would run its course. So whatever pain he encountered did not cause him any emotional or mental distress. It was born with. But anyway, he abandoned his ascetic practices, and thinking they didn't actually in and of themselves lead anywhere wholesome, which is interesting. So this is the eve of his awakening, where he's let go of his refined concentration practices, formless concentration practices. He's let go of the extreme asceticism. And so he's at a place of real openness and unknowingness, when he actually found a way through calm, tranquil mindfulness and clarity that arose from that, wakefulness that arose from that, that allowed him to understand something deep, that removed the final bit of ignorance or unknowing that was present. So in his first teaching, when he went back to these friends of his, who at first were a bit suspicious because he'd abandoned the ascetic practices, but legend has it that they saw him, as they saw him coming towards them, that he was radiant and had an air of awakening about him. And so they welcomed him to sit among them and to speak to them. And he talked to them. His first teaching then, in trying to convey something, he talked to them of what we now know as the Four Noble Truths. He actually tried to describe that what he realized in their fullness were these 4 truths. And without realizing them in their fullness, that is what obstructed until that time, had obstructed his full awakening. But now with this full awakening, he really fully understood these four things. So he's trying to convey to them very simply within this nutshell, what we now know is a nutshell of the Buddha-Dhamma, the Four Noble Truths. This is like all of his teachings that came afterwards, anything that we may be able to experience as human beings, whether on the path of Dharma or not, can be found within this nutshell of the Four Noble Truths. So it's referred to as the elephant's footprint, being the elephant being the largest animal in the forest. Its footprint encompasses all the footprints of any other creature that can be found in the forest. And so it's compared to this, the Four Noble Truths. Any Dharma teaching, any experience can be found within these four truths when they're unpacked. So speaking about these Four Noble Truths is what I want to go into today. Because they're the nutshell, we can come back to them again and again. And every time we open them up, it's almost like a holographic reality. You can look into these four truths in your own experience. They exist here. They're not an abstracted theory on reality. They exist here in this very body-mind, to be seen directly, to be known directly. And when I say they exist here, they're not like permanently residing somewhere as things within this thing called the body, but they can only be seen and understood here and now, these truths. The Four Noble Truths are actually, apart from the realization of Nibbana, which we talk about as the third truth, the cessation of suffering is the third truth. The rest of it is mundane reality, mundane insight. They're experiences to be seen, known, and understood here and now, but they also arise as insights. And this is in the insight mode when we really penetrate to the truth of suffering, which is the first truth, penetrate to the truth of the cause of suffering, realize the truth of the cessation of suffering, and recognize the path, what's called marga in Pali, or the path or the way of non-suffering. We recognize these truths in the moment, spontaneously, with realization. And in their realization mode, their instantaneous, transcendent understanding. When we unpack this understanding, we're starting to talk about the mundane realities of suffering. What is suffering? How does it arise? How do we contemplate it? How do we work with it? How do we be with this experience? How do we contemplate our experience in a way that allows the cessation of that experience of suffering and the realization of that freedom from suffering? This is the territory of the Four Noble Truths. So this is what he started to describe to his friends. He said, when I realized fully this truth or the experience of suffering, there was light, there was clarity, there was wisdom, there was insight, there was knowledge that arose spontaneously. And what arose he hadn't heard before from any other teacher. It was an intuitive wisdom, insight, knowledge that arose from within through his own seeing, with clarity, with awareness. So that's what this insight is about. And similarly, he spoke of the different aspects of those truths. When he realized fully the cause of suffering and realized or experienced the abandoning or the letting go of suffering, insight arose, knowledge, light, wisdom arose within. New understanding which freed his mind, freed his heart. To each of these four truths, he had the same experience. And he said he didn't declare full awakening without the full understanding of these truths. So that means that whilst we can have some degree of insight into the experience of suffering, into its cause, some degree of letting go of suffering, and some understanding of the path or the way of non-suffering, how to cultivate a life and this mind, which allows suffering to fall away. Until those understandings are complete, there is not the full awakening, the full snapping out of dualistic modes of entrapment, conceptual entrapment, subject, object, conceiving of I, me, and mine, which is an entrapping experience. Yeah, ultimately speaking, that's the description of this separate subject, the I, me, and mine, entrapping, but seeing the mentally constructed reality of that and the mind breaking out of it, experiencing something completely beyond that those mentally constructed conditioned modes of perceiving were seen in perspective and understood for what they are. They still function as a conventional reality, whilst there's still this body inhabiting this world, but those constructs are totally seen through for what they are, as conventional realities, and not believed to be ultimately who and what one is with this new awakening. So the Buddha tried to explain this to his friends, and as he explained it, one of those friends actually had some insight into what he was saying. So from that first teaching, one of those 5 friends actually gained the first stage of enlightenment, what's called Sotapatti. And his insight, what was his insight? It's said in this particular sutta, his insight was that all that arises ceases. Everything that comes into being, all experiences that arise, that have a beginning, anything that has a beginning also has an end. That's the complete picture. Nothing that arises is permanent. All that arises ceases. So this is a very global insight. It might sound very small to the conceptual mind, but when you start to contemplate it, everything in this world, whether you consider externally, from the plants, the animals, the insects, the biosphere, the sun, the moon, this body, this mind, these senses, everything that we experience in the past, present, and future, it is all impermanent in that it does not sustain as a continuous reality. Everything that arises ceases. And science proves this, knows this directly with the help of a microscope in some cases, but in most cases you can verify that very simply yourself by simply contemplating. Every one of your experiences, has any of it ever sustained through the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, thoughts, sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, thoughts, concepts, bodies, everything we experience arises and ceases. Now, this truth in itself has many layers that can be penetrated and understood through a process of contemplation, which brings the mind to deep insight. And this process of contemplation is really something of familiarizing the mind with this, what we call this characteristic of impermanence or change or transience, non-permanence. Just, it's anicca in the Pali. The Pali is the Buddhist language, the scriptural language. It's called anicca. Everything is in a process of change. So this, just remember this. We'll go more into speaking about how to practice with this later on. But this is the primary insight that leads to awakening. And it did for this one friend of the Buddha's who had that insight, and he's considered first stage of awakening, of which in the Theravada, in this tradition, is 4 stages of awakening. And the Buddha recognized that, and he declared that, said, Kondanya knows, Kondanya has understood, which must have been somewhat gratifying that the way he explained what he understood actually conveyed successfully. So this is another kind of ratification of this paradigm of the Four Noble Truths, that it has effective conveyance when it is spoken about from someone who understands, from an enlightened mind, and it can actually be with someone whose mind is open and contemplating with enough clarity can recognize a similar realization. So this is important, that realization occurred for Kondanya because he saw something within. The Buddha's words were simply helping to direct his mind to see something, to contemplate this experience of suffering, to look at its origin, to look how it arises within, and to recognize that having arisen, it also ceases. To look at that with clarity. Clarity, to a large degree, allows a freedom, a non-attachment, a non-clinging. There's a witnessing, observing. And when the experience of suffering ceases before one's very own awareness, that experience of freedom is what informs the mind of the possibility or the reality beyond suffering, beyond identification with suffering, beyond identification with limited things, such as this body, these thoughts, these mind states and emotions. When these things are seen to be appearing and disappearing in and of themselves, the heart is released from attachment, released from clinging. When seen clearly, it's that simple. And in that understanding, the comprehension of the 4th Noble Truth, of the way of non-suffering, or sometimes called the way of abiding, or the way to the end of suffering, is understood and comprehended. It's a mode of, you could say it's a mode of observing or a mode of awareness, non-clinging, and non-clinging awareness, or an open awareness that sees clearly the nature of reality. So this knowledge, this insight is induced not from anything we're forcing, not from a new ingredient, but allowing the mind to rest in its natural clarity. And there's many things that can support that. But from its natural clarity, seeing the nature of reality is direct. And that is the liberating insight. Now, it's hard to convey how much one can understand from a moment of liberating insight. But truly, there is tremendous understanding that can arise just from this much. The profundity of reality can only be seen directly and non-conceptually. Concepts, you can only think of one thing at a time. We might think that we're thinking of multitasking, you're thinking of a dozen things at a time, but actually that's just attention jumping between so many different things. This is what I call fragmented mind. So we're juggling, we can juggle 10 balls maybe, but there's still single balls that have, in one moment of time, one ball is held. But you might have 20, 10, 6, 3 balls in the air at once, right? But somehow the nature of insight, the profundity of the mind, great mysteries of this experience of being can be penetrated directly, non-conceptually, and understood in a profound manner. So this is really the tremendous teaching of the Buddha. Through these 4 truths, they're like portals of understanding that open up a massive, massive vista. They're portals of insight that open up a massive vista of understanding. So what are they? Let's go into them a little bit more. The truth, the first noble truth, is simply called the truth of dukkha, the truth of unsatisfactoriness, or the truth of suffering. The second is the truth of the origin or the cause or the arising of that suffering. The third is the truth of the cessation, the ending, the abandoning, the letting go of that suffering. Or in another way, we can say it's the non-arising of that suffering. Once it's seen through, it no longer arises. And the fourth truth is the way, what gets called the Noble Eightfold Path. So the Buddha talks about this fourth truth as the Noble Eightfold Path, and we'll talk more specifically about details of that in our next session. Just to unpack these 4 truths a little bit more. The truth of suffering. Why did the Buddha start with talking about suffering when he had this tremendous experience of awakening? Because he said, as I intimated before, he said in one teaching that it's because of the reason that we've traveled for endless time in cycles of rebirth and experiencing suffering and never finding a way out, in some sense. This notion of samsara, this idea of cyclic suffering and confusion, not understanding. The reason we've traveled for countless eons in such a fashion is because of not understanding, not penetrating these 4 noble truths. But with their penetration, with their full understanding, one comes out of this cyclic suffering. Samsara ceases. Suffering ceases. So that's why he focused on these 4 truths. And another reason is that starting with this experience of suffering, it is something that everyone can relate to. Everyone, all of us in our lives. It's the experience of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, whether in its modes of, say, discontent or frustration or anger or jealousy, various kinds of emotional states, or to the other extreme of despair and anguish and deep confusion. All of this is on the spectrum called dukkha, or suffering, bodily, mental, emotional, both unsatisfactoriness and suffering. So unsatisfactoriness might not be pain. It may be about pleasant things that end all too soon, that you can never seem to sustain the pleasantness. And therefore, those pleasant experiences are talked about as unsatisfactory because they're fleeting. They don't actually bring lasting reprieve. Right? And so as human beings, we find ourselves encountering different experiences of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness, being somewhat confounded by them, trying to find our way to more pleasant experiences and to allay the unpleasant as much as possible through various means, chasing wealth, chasing comfort, trying to control our experiences, pushing the unpleasant out of our awareness or ignoring it, suppressing it, repressing it, putting a band-aid over it, whatever we do to get away from the experience of dis-ease or suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Have we found a way that ends in complete freedom from it yet? For most of us, for those of us who haven't yet found the path or haven't had any insight, we usually would say, no, we haven't yet found a way. And so we're continuing to look. At least those of us who have woken up to the sense that there might be a way to the end of suffering, we look. And after a while, we start to see that a lot of our means of dealing with this stuff don't work. Suffering rebounds in one way or another. And our confusion about it is suffering in and of itself. Why is it that I'm getting caught up in these emotional states that I don't understand? These bodily conditions that feel frustrating and painful and difficult. We can't keep the body young forever. We can't keep the body healthy forever. We can't get away from the aging process. We're vulnerable to accident, having been born. We're vulnerable to aging, illness, accident, death. So one reliable thing is that having been born, we will die, but we don't know when. So that causes its own kind of anxiety and dukkha. So this confusion about it is suffering in and of itself. So the Buddha points to this experience of suffering as being a common, pervasive experience and the driver of so much of our activity. Our desire to get away from suffering, our desire for pleasant experiences, our desire to understand even, is rooted in that experience of dukkha. But he says, the only reason that we haven't yet found the end of dukkha through all our means is because we don't understand it. We haven't comprehended this first truth, what he called the first truth of the truth of dukkha itself. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it arises directly, really, how it comes to be, and how it can be abandoned or let go of. So not knowing these things, it persists in various ways. So he's basically saying through all our means in confusion of trying to get away from it, we're barking up the wrong tree because it doesn't cure it. It doesn't bring a remedy. So pointing out this truth of dukkha is saying that we need to look at it, we need to understand it. And through that understanding, we come to the realization of how to let it cease, how to transcend it, how to move beyond it. And this is all described in the path How do we begin to address this experience of dukkha? How do we begin to live our life? How do we begin to view this experience of body, of emotion, of mentality in a way that brings relief from dukkha? So the path, in this sense, the Four Noble Truths are considered like a medical diagnosis. It was apparently this fourfold structure was a kind of a way, a medical diagnosis. So dukkha being the ailment, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness being the ailment or the disease. Dukkha is also can be translated as disease. Obviously, the cause of dukkha, we're looking at the cause of the problem. What is the root cause of the problem? And when we can remove the root cause, we can bring about a cure. So the root cause is the second truth to be understood and acted upon, bringing about a cure. We can realize, yes, dukkha, a cure is possible, healing is possible in this sense. And the fourth truth is the medicine, or the way of practice is like the medicine one takes in order to remove the symptoms of the disease or remove the disease itself so that one arrives at health or a cure. So this is the Eightfold Path, the way, which is profound in and of itself, but in terms of our daily life, it's about everything we do. It's about reassessing and reevaluating how we live. It doesn't have to be in a dramatic sense, but recognizing that our actions have results, our actions of body, speech, and mind. In this world of cause and effect, there is this law operating, and our actions of body, speech, and mind have an effect here and now on this embodied experience, as well as on those around us and further into the field, relational field. So starting to understand what causes bring what effect, we start to understand a way that supports or allows the allaying of suffering. The path can be summed up in three aspects: sila, samadhi, panya, or wholesome living, mind cultivation or meditation, and panya is wisdom, often considered right view and right intention. And we'll go into these in more detail. But the Buddha very clearly taught that suffering comes into being because of a cause. Nothing comes into being without a cause. And when we understand this process of cause and effect, we can work with that law of cause and effect in a way that allows the minimizing and the ultimate cessation of suffering. So this path of wholesome living, of meditation or mental mind cultivation and wisdom. The wholesome living is about, within every spiritual tradition, there's this encouragement to recognize how our actions of body, speech, and mind, if they're done with mental negativity through anger, aversion, delusion, selfish desire, jealousy, when our actions are motivated by mind states of negativity, then they bring unpleasant results right in that very moment, but also reverberating. They can come back to us at a later time. They can cause ourselves suffering in the moment and cause other people pain and suffering as well through our actions. So the first thing is to recognize that actually we have the power to ameliorate and to first to contemplate our experience and then ameliorate our actions through refraining from what's called unwholesome or certain activity that brings pain. Unwholesomeness in the Buddhist or unskillfulness in the Buddhist language of the path. We're not just talking about trying to say this is bad, and if this action is bad, that means you're bad. It's not personalizing it in that sense. It's actually trying to observe cause and effect in terms of your own experience on the level of action, of intention, of body, speech, and mind. Anything that we intend to speak or to do, we learn to examine or recognize, is that intention imbued with the things that are going to bring suffering? And Buddha was really clear about what does that. Greed, anger, delusion. Delusion is suffering under the delusion of, the confusion about reality and its laws. Any action that comes out of those states won't lead to the end of suffering. And they're likely to bring suffering here and now and in the future. So he called them unskillful or unwholesome, not only because they bring more suffering, but also because they don't lead to liberation. They don't lead to freedom and the end of suffering. So the onus, in some sense, was on us to understand the law's functioning and to practice, trying to get a little picture here, to practice to understand what's going on, because once we understand that certain mind states always bring suffering, once we really see that for ourselves, there's a natural inclination away from it. It's like, we don't want to do that. Why would I want to bring more suffering on myself? So we don't do that. We refrain from that, even if it's a really habitual thing. We start to refrain. We find we have the will and the power to refrain from. And when we see that something causes others suffering, similarly, we don't want that. We don't want to cause pain. So this sensitivity to what causes pain, what causes suffering, becomes more pronounced. And this really fuels our practice path, because the more we refrain from or learn to let go of negativity, see through it and not act on it, or if we have acted to somehow ameliorate in some way, we see that this leads to feelings of non-suffering, feelings of ease, of relaxation, of openness, of more joy even. So even on this level, we can see for ourselves how mind states or intentions of kindness, compassion, the intention of harmlessness, the intention of letting go, how these states in and of themselves, when actions of body, speech, and mind have these states as their intention, they actually bring joy, ease, pleasure, even if they go a little bit wrong, we can be sure that our intention was not harmful, was not acting out of negativity. And so even when the aimed for results don't come to fruition, it's let go of. So the heart becomes lighter and clearer. And this is the basis that allows the mind to clear. And as I said earlier, with the clarity, one sees more deeply into the nature of reality. One's meditation and clarity about cause and effect and the path emerges ever more strongly. So when we contemplate these characteristics of impermanence of all conditioned things and the impersonality of all conditioned things, and when grasping and chasing conditioned things in our lives, how we're attaching, how this brings immediate effects of suffering and limitation. Once we see this more and more clearly, the mind lets go. And the more it lets go, the more it penetrates into a deeper reality, the underlying ever-present reality that is, let's just say, it's your own deepest nature beyond the changing phenomena of this world. Even beyond the power of intention, even though we use the power of intention and attention to help clear the mind and see reality, see the function of cause and effect, ultimately the mind lets go of identification with any of that to experience full freedom. So I'll bring my talk to a close there. This talk about the Four Noble Truths. One could talk a lifetime on the Four Noble Truths. So I hope this hour was succinct enough to convey something of the Buddha's teachings. And as we go through this series of 6 sessions, we'll be revisiting, as I say, these Four Noble Truths are like a nutshell. So we'll be revisiting them because they form the basis of everything else, all the other teachings and contemplations that come about, that lead to this freedom from suffering. So I'll stop there for now, and please pop any of your questions into the chat box, and we can spend another 35 minutes on some Q&A. Thank you. So there was one question that came in earlier. Eve was asking about the illusory body that appears to be solid, that which appears to be so real even in the dream state. So the illusory body, it doesn't feel illusory when we're experiencing it in our normal mode. And, you know, we might have to unpack this word illusion or illusory. Illusion means that something is appearing to be one way when in reality it's another way. Right? So illusion doesn't necessarily mean it's completely non-existent or that it has no kind of reality, but that it's perceived one way when actually it's in its true state is another way. So for now, I'll just say that without understanding, without insight into the nature of this body-mind, which is what this path is all about, we tend to perceive this body as a solid lump of reality. We tend to perceive it as quite concrete. We tend to perceive it as me, as mine, what I am. And this is in the face of a plain reality, is what I was talking about, of the experience of anicca. The fact that this body is actually changing from moment to moment. Is this the same body as your 1-year-old body? Or as your 1-month-old body? Is it the same body as your 10-year-old body? Is it the same body as your 40-year-old or 70-year-old or your 90-year-old body? Conventionally speaking, we tend to think of it as me all the way along that trajectory from conception to death. This is me, mine, and my body. But in actuality, it's a different body. At every point, everything you eat every day is going in to build new cells, and it's sloughing off and old cells are dying. It's rejuvenating every day. But we tend to give more, our society, our education processes, our human conditioned perception tends to see this body as one shape, one concrete, unchanging thing. Even in the face of that very clear evidence that it's changing all the time, it's rather out of our control. We can't stop it getting ill or aging. So I'll just say that much for now, because that's the obvious illusion. Conceptually, we conceive of it as something concrete and solid and unchanging, when in actual fact it's a process. This body is actually a process. It's only ever existent in this moment. There's no past body, even though the past body is a precursor of what's present. And just as your breakfast is a precursor of what's present now or tomorrow, those precursors disappear, are changing, are transmuted moment to moment. So, how is it the same body? But our concepts, we fix it into something concrete with concepts, and there lay the illusion. So as we practice, and particularly in meditation, we start to analyze what this experience of body and mind is, moment by moment, through a phenomenological contemplation, relying on present moment awareness. And this reveals more and more the chasm between our conditioned concepts of the way things are, in contrast to the reality of elements arising and ceasing in a perpetual motion. Now we'll come back to that again and again in different parts of this series. So Liza just made a comment, there is no one to be awakened. And that is true at the end of the path, when one realizes the non-existence of an individual concrete I, me, mine. But if we lock onto a concept that there is no one to be awakened before true insight has shattered that concept of I, me, mine, then we might be locked into another kind of illusion. So it can be a helpful practice contemplation, to when you feel a strong experience to do something, or you're a strong experience of emotional or mental agitation or grief or whatever in the moment, to question who's experiencing this, can help release attachment and identification with momentary experiences on the level of body, mind, and emotion. Who is the one who's experiencing this? Find it, find them. That is a powerful meditative contemplation. But if you attach the concept that there is no one, that can take you down a different rabbit hole. So be careful, be awake. What is the difference between relaxation and meditation? Well, relaxation is the feeling of relaxation in the body, and the relaxation of the mind, the sense of opening out, relaxing, letting go of, holding on to tension, to stress, to ideas. It's kind of a relaxing into the experience of being, just as you settle this body into a relaxing bath, if you like baths, if they're relaxing for you. So when the mind relaxes, all the tensions fall away. So the difference between relaxation and meditation, well, relaxation can be an experience within meditation. So meditation, when we're cultivating calm and clarity, then learning how to relax the body-mind, or letting the body-mind relax, is an aspect of meditation. I'll just say that for now, because that calmness allows a clarity to emerge, allows the mind and the body to defrag. So it's that clarity of mind which has the capacity to see more clearly into the nature of reality. It's like when the wind stops blowing on the surface of a lake, or let's say when the wind is blowing on the surface of the lake, it ripples the water, so you can't see into the water and it doesn't reflect the external environment. But when that wind relaxes, when the wind subsides, there's nothing to stir up the lake. The surface of the lake becomes calm. And in good light, you can see through the surface of the lake into the lake to see the various contents, the fish, the plants, maybe even the pebbles or the bed of the lake. And it also has the capacity to reflect the external environment, the trees, the moon, the sun. And that's its natural state when the wind is relaxed. Or one could say when the lake is relaxed without the disturbance of the wind. So that direct metaphor for mind and clarity, seeing the nature of reality. So Alex asks, why do teachers speak of going inside during meditation when all that we can have access to is the content of consciousness? There is no inside and outside in consciousness. Well, yes, that obviously can be realized. I guess why people maybe talk about going inside initially is because we're starting with the general orientation of human beings who generally have a view of, inside as being within, when I close my eyes, and what I experience within this body on the level of sensations or emotion in the mind or mind states, thinking, etc. And the general idea of outside is something outside this skin bag, you know, the contents of this room, the cat, the house, the trees, other people are external to this skin bag, to this bodily frame. So it's conventional language, what we call conventional inside and outside. So the encouragement to turn inside, obviously, is to bring your attention from those outer objects, which we're often caught up in our waking hours. We're dealing with outer objects all the time, even though it is, as you say, the contents of consciousness. We still perceive an inside and an outside. So when it comes to meditation, close the eyes. We're not engaged in eating during meditation. We're not engaged in other tactile activities apart from sitting. We're not going out to turn on a radio or stereo or listen to music. We just sounds appear from the environment. So now we can contemplate the sense experience as it appears. Sensations at the body, sounds at the ear door, and at the mind. We can become aware of the thoughts, even if thoughts are thinking of objects in the external environment, we can recognize them just as thoughts. And as you say, there is ultimately no inside, no outside. But to encourage people to bring their awareness to the body, you have a general sense of drawing your attention to a localized quality of experience. And as we develop the meditation, you know, this is one of the primary paradigms of the Buddha, is that we contemplate the sense experience, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, as arising here and now, dependent on this body and mind. It's all just here and now. And the sense of outside, inside is kind of an overlay. And Alex, you know this, of course. But it's our conventional language. When we talk about conventions, there's a me and a you. Cat's over there. This body's here. We talk, and this is what I was saying early on in this session, that our language is embedded in a space-time duality, here and there, inside, outside, me, you. You know, but we do need to recognize this is describing what we call conventional reality, which is accepted, conditioned perception. And that the more we get into meditation, our language begins to change somewhat to describe, as you mentioned there, the content of consciousness. We're starting to analyze the content of consciousness, and we come upon an experience that there is no inside, outside. Once you're familiar with consciousness as a global experience, then it's just the appearing and disappearing of sense contact, sense impression. So as I was saying to someone earlier, a lot of the illusoriness that starts to fall away is really embedded more in our concepts of the dualistic inside, outside, me, you, here, there, now, then, etc. So there's 3 questions here from Alex. Forest tradition seems to put an accent on awareness, presence, knowing. Yes. All phenomena except nibbana are dependently originated. What is the reason to abide in awareness if it's a conditioned phenomena? Is awareness a conditioned phenomena? That's your koan, Alex. Is awareness a conditioned phenomena? Is awareness the same as consciousness, sense consciousness? Consciousness arises and ceases. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. We can know, we can be aware of the arising and ceasing of consciousness. Different traditions will speak differently about these words: consciousness, awareness, mind. It can be confusing. We have to rely on our own investigation ultimately, but also the teachings of the masters, those who have fully awakened, not on the commentaries, not on necessarily what I say or other teachers say, but take the teachings and contemplate them. The Buddha said, you will only awaken to reality through your own insight. So this territory of awareness, consciousness is very refined. So I encourage you to look into it more and more. And yes, the forest tradition puts a lot of accent on awareness, presence, knowing, because from the perspective of this tradition, it transcends conditioned consciousness. The essence of knowing and awareness is ultimately transcendent, unconditioned. How does forest tradition view awareness versus the objects of awareness? Just as I said, are objects in awareness different from awareness, or it's just a modification of the same condition? Both. You have to come into a place of contemplating your conscious experience. What is it that knows the objects of your awareness? It's not to find a thing there, but know that even within the Buddhist suttas, in the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha is encouraging us to contemplate the arising and ceasing of consciousness as mind consciousness, thoughts, perceptions, ideas, any mental movement, as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. These all can be broken down into their sense base, sense object, and the consciousness that arises dependent on the two. But that consciousness that arises, consciousness vijnana, also known as cognition, is momentary. It's impermanent. It arises and ceases. Yet there's that which knows, can know that directly. So that's the territory for your contemplation. For your contemplation doesn't mean thinking. It means meditative experience, meditative awareness. So you have to allow your meditation to come to a place into still awareness, to see the truth of these things. As soon as you start thinking about them, you're creating subject-object, or the mind is in the process of dualistic perception. Sorry, I only answer these questions relatively briefly, but I'm trying to be really succinct, and we'll come back to these things more and more within the sessions. In some ways, we can say it's awareness and its objects are the same, are different, and is a modification of the same condition. But every view of each tradition and its practices will come at things with a particular view, and within your own experience, using that paradigmatic perspective, you can come into a certain experience, but that paradigmatic perspective itself has to drop away, or will drop away, when the mind penetrates to see that reality clearly. The understanding will only come out of that direct experience, which is freed of those paradigmatic concepts. So the paradigmatic concepts are something which can carry the contemplation or frame a contemplation, the insight, and can assist in setting up a perspective for insight to occur. But true insight is non-conceptual. Yeah. And understanding of what occurred there will arise after the fact in order to describe it or convey it. What about mental illness? Specifically, is meditation and practice recommended for those with mental illness, or is it recommended to get treatment before starting practice as a sort of precursor? Well, Val, this depends very much on what mental illness, what kind of mental illness you're talking about. Obviously, for some people with mental illness, to sit in meditation and watch the mind is not recommended for some people because there's not necessarily enough perspective or clarity to get perspective on the contents of the mind. So it can actually pull one into more delusion. So, but that doesn't mean that practice in the wider sense isn't recommended, because practice in the Buddhist tradition, as I said earlier, is about cultivating a wholesome way of being in the world and contemplating what is harmful, what is helpful, what is unskillful, what's skillful, what leads to suffering, what gives rise to suffering in the moment, and what gives rise to happiness or allayance of suffering in the moment. So these practices, without sitting still and, cultivating meditation, these things can be contemplated by anyone with that capacity. You need some kind of clarity to understand this paradigm, to contemplate that harmful actions cause suffering here, right now, and in the future, as well as to those you speak angrily to or act aversively towards. We have to be prepared to self-reflect and prepared to modify our behavior to explore what is helpful, what is unhelpful, what is harmful, what is beneficial. This is a primary aspect of practice. And then when we understand what's beneficial, the Buddha gave pretty clear guidelines. If you want to cultivate this spiritual path, he did recommend what was known as the 5 precepts, to refrain from killing, from stealing, from lying, from sexual misconduct, to refrain from intoxicants and drink and drugs which lead to confusion and carelessness of mind. These 5 things are something that we can all embrace, and actually they bring happiness and joy into your life when we learn to refrain from these things. And if we don't, we can see that actually the enacting of those things, such as killing living beings or stealing or lying or sexual misconduct or overindulgence in drink and drugs, or to the point of confusing and confounding the mind or not reducing one's clarity. And I'm not talking about prescription medicine, I'm talking about, lifestyle drugs for entertainment and distraction, and drink similarly. These don't bring anything good, really. once you contemplate that and know that for yourself, then you can have the energy to refrain from going that way. Changing direction, particularly if it's habit, takes some effort to change direction, to refrain from actions. And it takes a contemplation of knowing what mind state's present. If anger is present, refrain from speaking on that or acting on that, unless it's a time where you can really transform that into clarity and say skillful things that remedy a certain situation. Anyway, there's so many different ways one could talk about this, but yes, people can practice without having to necessarily sit down and meditate if that is not in itself conducive for their mental health at that time. So Raphael said, amazing clarity and skill in this teaching, Ayya Jitindriya. You convey the Buddha-Dhamma with such skill and ease. Oh, thank you, Raphael. I thought there might be a question in there, but thank you for that comment. I'm glad it's conveying. I'll just say it's tricky to convey to an audience I don't know the level of understanding, but I'm trying to keep my language in a sense that it will convey both to newcomers to Buddhism and those who are already deeply into the practice. Why do we translate the second noble truth as desire when tanha clearly means thirst? And why is it that the cause of suffering, when we know that moga raga and Vaishya, that's Sanskrit, Maharaga. Okay, I think that's greed, hatred, and delusion are the cause. Yeah, so a lot of people use the translation of tanha as desire or craving or thirst. I guess desire is a word used because it's more readily understood. And desire is an element, a large element of thirst, because when you break down the cause of suffering, the Buddha talks about craving for sense pleasure, craving to be, and craving to be or craving to exist, and craving to not be or not exist. These are the three kinds of tanha. So its direct meaning is thirst, but a lot of people think, well, what does that mean, thirst? So thirst for sense desire, thirst for being, desire to be, thirst to not be. So desire is a little more easy to comprehend in English, I think, but it can create some misunderstandings too, because, because there's also desire to do good, desire to follow the path. But these, in one sense, if they're not accompanied by a wise understanding, can be sources of dukkha as well. Desire to become a better person than I am is actually, whilst it's a wholesome intention, it's still coming out of a sense of limited me and mine. So that person, even in that desire, may be suffering because of this concept of I'm not a good person, or I have to become something better in the future. Whereas the Buddha's teaching is pointing to something here and now, something that is present here and now, that if abandoned, releases the mind. And although in the conventional sense we cultivate wholesome qualities, and that can take time, and this does have its tremendous benefit in transforming mind and bringing understanding, ultimately insight is direct and spontaneous and doesn't necessarily truly depend on those conditioned aspects of body and mind. That's why it's liberative. But what we're doing in creating wholesomeness is creating a context that is conducive for insight to occur, and lessening the causes of suffering in the karmic sense in the process. So the Buddha called this like right view, right action, right speech, etc., that ripens on the side of merit, which means it ripens in wholesome karma or happiness, good fortune. But the insight or the right view and perspective that ripens on the side of liberation or insight is actually transcendent of karma and time and space. You know, so it's very hard to describe, but you may know what I'm talking about. So various translations for thirst, for craving, for tanha. But we have to contemplate the cause of suffering. So why is it the cause of suffering when we know that greed, hatred, and delusion are the cause? Well, if you look at greed and hatred, at their root is desire or tanha or thirst. Desire to be, to have something, to get something, or to get rid of something. To have an experience, to get an experience, or to get rid of an experience is actually at the root of moha, dosa, and raga, greed, hatred, and delusion. Yeah, so tanha is at the root. But why is tanha the cause of suffering and not ignorance, which is the first in the chain of dependent origination, first in the cause? Because that ignorance is actually described as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Not knowing, not fully understanding and comprehending these Four Noble Truths that I talked about is the primary cause of samsaric cycling, of suffering, of a view, ways of action that lead to suffering, of greed, hatred, and delusion. Ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. That's a way to sum it up. That's why tanha is the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, because it's ignorance, not really understanding tanha, not really understanding dukkha, suffering, not really understanding how tanha comes to be, how it arises in a causal chain, not understanding how it also ceases. It's an impermanent condition. When it's not grasped at or identified with as I, me, or mine, not taken on, not picked up, not traveled with, it ceases, it collapses. So it can't lead to suffering as its next causal sequence. So when you see into the nature of tanha as impermanent, as dukkha, as not self, when you see it's a conditioned arising dependent on feeling, it arises always dependent on feeling. If feeling is not grasped at, identified with, if tanha is not grasped at, identified with, it collapses, it disappears, it ceases. There you find your liberation through the full understanding of that condition. Marion, in recent years, I've been questioning reincarnation and wondering if it's another concept, possibly a comforting one. Well, it is another concept, that's for certain, because for most of us, we don't have direct experience of or memory of our past lives. We don't have direct psychic experience of that the Buddhas have of actually seeing their past lives and seeing beings reborn according to karma, passing from one kind of existence into another. So this is the way it's described in the sutras. So we don't have that direct insight. So we hear and understand this teaching conceptually. So that's okay. You don't have to believe in it like 100% faith. It can be like many of the other things that we don't yet have direct understanding of. It can be there without it interfering with our Dharma practice. Obviously, if you have serious doubts about it, it can interfere with, your motivation even to practice. The way I understand it is because as you look into your mind from moment to moment in meditation, and as you understand cause and effect just on the level of this mind that you can see here and now, on the level of past actions and their results, even on the level of eating. You have this body eats, it has to defecate as a result. You drink, you have to urinate as a result. So this is one level of cause and effect. But you start to look into nature and so-called external nature, the cause of a tree, a little acorn from a previous mature tree, without the causes and conditions of fertile earth, of enough moisture, of enough heat, of the right conditions in the environment. Without that, a tree won't come to be. But with the right conditions, a tree grows from that acorn or that seed. So just understanding cause and effect in this way can be helpful. And then, but particularly looking at one's own heart and our emotional states, looking to the causes of anger, attachment, desire. The Buddha gave us particular paradigms to contemplate how these things arise. I won't go into it in detail, but I've found that contemplating the mind and seeing the causes and the conditions for the continuity of certain mind states of thinking, etc., that's given me a kind of a blueprint and understanding for how I can accept this concept of rebirth. In our tradition, we call it rebirth rather than reincarnation, as a stream of causes and conditions, just as the mind is a stream of causes and conditions which create a certain sense of continuity. So I can see that without deep insight, this just keeps rolling on. Just as in your meditation, without bringing your attention to the breath and the body, just that simple intention, your attention will keep rolling with one thought after another, and each thought is a condition, a cause and condition for the next thought through associative thinking. But without interrupting that stream, it'll roll on kind of forever. If you let your mind roll on, just as an experiment, observe the thinking mind, it goes on forever. It'll come up with past and future imagination, and it'll roll on forever. As long as your attention is rolling with thought, it has this kind of continuous associative thinking process. So I can really understand cyclic suffering and samsara just from watching that. Just roll on. But when I recognize it, when I wake up to it as a conditioned process and direct my attention to here and now through the body and breath, I interrupt that process, or that process of perpetual thinking has been interrupted. It just dissolves, doesn't go anywhere. It's just an illusion that has ceased being supported by one's attention and one's desire to think what's coming next, what's coming next, where do I go next? Enough desire to keep following, enough of a lure, like the donkey with the carrot suspended 1 foot in front of its head. It'll keep walking because it wants to eat that carrot. It'll keep walking forever because it thinks the carrot's not far away. Does it ever get the carrot? Ajahn Brahm once said to me many moons ago, when it stops, the carrot swings back and he can chomp it. When it stops is the key there. But the real meaning in that analogy is that it's samsaric. The donkey will keep going after the carrot. And we've got so many carrots in our mind stream, the things we want, because of desire, unrecognized, unconscious desire, craving. There's this continuous following the carrot. We think we're going to get some kind of satisfaction in the end, some kind of reward, and we go, keep going, until you wake up. Say, man, that is a forever conditioned process. There's no ending there. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to withdraw my attention from that, put it somewhere else. And what a relief to come out of that. Just for a moment. But there you can taste what the end of suffering or suffering, samsara, might be. That's why it's called stopping, cessation, nirodha, nibbana. Time's moving on, people. I'm going to try and briefly move through these questions. I've overshot the mark. If you want to stay with me, all good, or you can come back at a later time to finish. Let's see. Did the Buddha believe more in leading by example or with verbal teaching? Absolutely both, Matt. Everything he did was example, absolutely. But he gave verbal teachings in response to questioners and in response to what he saw, what was needed. Great. There's just a lot of comments here. Thank you, people. Glad you've enjoyed the meditation and Dharma talk. Next session is in 6 weeks' time. The dates will be on our website. The other sessions are already dated and in queue on this YouTube channel. So if you click for notifications, you'll get notification, but make a note of the date. Great, getting through these comments. Aren't other traditions of Buddhism completely different since they use different scriptures outside of the canon? Good question. One thing I wanted to reiterate or mention about early Buddhism is that we're looking at this period of Buddhism that is actually common to all traditions, pre-sectarian Buddhism. So in the few hundred years after the Buddha's death. So we have the collected discourses, one of the oldest recensions of which is the Pali Canon, but they're also corresponding with the Chinese agamas. So these actually form the basis of all Buddhist traditions. Now, other teachings and commentaries came later in each tradition and somewhat began to change shape of the trajectory of these different traditions, but all have this early Buddhist teachings, as can be found in agamas and Pali Canon, not all of it, but where they correspond, we can be pretty sure it's the early Buddhist teachings. So these are primary teachings that belong to all Buddhist traditions that I'm going to be covering. Word of the mouth Buddha, because they're so pervasive throughout the whole scriptures that they're unquestionable. Okay, very good. Does delusion often follow moments of deep insight? Well, it can null if one grasps that insight. If one says, that's it, I've got it now. Woohoo, I'm awake. The I thought is just another concept. Deep insight, you see that. Insight happens non-conceptually, but thoughts that come afterwards can be delusory. And even experiences that come afterwards, if grasped at and if clung to, like, this is great, now I've got to get back to it. Who has got to get back to what? So many of the masters teach us to not cling to those insights, to glean the benefit and understanding of those insights, but don't let it interfere with the continual process. Inevitably, it does. In our naivety and in our path progress, we will be grasping at these memories and ideas, but recognize in that moment that they are memories, and it's okay to let them go, because the deep insight transforms the heart forever. It stays. Memories come and go. Deep understanding has already transformed the mind, so that can never be forgotten. So trust that. Remember that Ajahn Brahm also said that the donkey said to the carrot, the door of my mouth is always open to you. Yes, very funny. So basically saying, in every moment the mind is present and open. Whatever carrots appear, whatever lures appear, if we remember this present openness, we see those things for what they are. And the present openness is the portal for deep insight and liberation. What book do you recommend for a beginner Buddhist? Look, there's a very old book I often recommend. It's called What the Buddha Taught by Walpola Rahula. Walpola, W-A-L-P-O-L-A. Rahula is R-A-H-U-L-A. He was a monk in the Sri Lankan tradition. A very succinct, good book that draws on the sutras, gives you the basic of early Buddhist teachings. So it's an oldie but a goodie. Yeah. You can go on our website. We have a resources tab, and you'll find different links in those pages for free books. You can explore what's there and what looks good to you. Very good. I think we've come to the end of our questions. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you received or were able to glean some understanding or pointings from what I was saying. Keep it simple as far as possible, even if my words have appeared to complicate things. I look forward to tuning in with you all in 6 weeks' time for the next one of this series. But in between, in 2 weeks' time, Jayasara will be back with our usual meditation and Q&A. And I will be back the following 2 weeks for standard Q&A, meditation. And then the 2 weeks after that, we'll have our second series in the Buddha-Dhamma teachings. So, great. Thank you all, everyone. I look forward to your comments, to know that, maybe feedback, what was helpful, what was not helpful in the comments on the video. That might be helpful for future sessions. Thanks, everyone. Take good care of yourselves and everyone around you. Much love. Bye for now.